Blur of History by Jane Shefs. It was a warm summer's day when the last features of the milestone were carved into the stone. The Roman soldier stepped back and smiled to himself. The milestone liked the man's attire, a red cloak and a leather breastplate over a red tunic. Another man, similarly dressed, approached him. "Well done," he said, looking at the milestone. He came closer and patted the top of the milestone in a friendly gesture.
"Now you shall witness the future as you guide us,"
he said. The man left, followed by an army, and the days passed. The nearby forest grew, then was cut down, then grew again. Men and women walked, horses trotted, and wooden carts rattled by. Over time, the milestone noticed that their clothes changed a little. So did the language. It became more like singing. Armies of Romans moved up, and individual soldiers returned until they stopped coming all together. Small fights occasionally broke out near the milestone, but otherwise it seemed like a quiet part of the world. One day, a massive army of men with spears and swords marched past, led by a man on horseback with a golden helmet on his head and a bright red cloak. The milestone heard someone address the man as King Clovis. The march seemed like a blink of a moment before life continued quietly. The forest was cut down, then regrown, and the people changed their clothing style, now completely covered from neck to toe all year round. Then a huge party passed the milestone with a man called Charlemagne on horseback at the head, wearing silks, a red cloak, and the most ornate and useless helmet the milestone had ever seen. The man didn't lead the party, but even the milestone could see he was important. After the party, people mingled, blending further into their surroundings. Soldiers often marched or rode by, but in smaller groups. There were still occasional fights, but the milestone hardly noticed them. The forest around the milestone was cleared entirely and replaced by fields and pastures. This allowed the milestone to see much further. Then another massive group passed by, mostly on horseback. They were carrying large crosses and many different flags. It felt like a moment before the milestone saw some of them return, looking worse for wear. But the milestone noticed a few who looked much better, returning in white tunics with red crosses and large shields of the same design. They carried themselves with panache and smugness, but it didn't last long. The milestone lost track of the years swooshing by, but it would have guessed that within 100 years, the men in white tunics, called Templars, met their doom, for some were dragged off in chains, their white tunics no longer white or even in full shape. Then the white flags with the red cross returned in a different language than the milestone had ever heard before. Small fights broke out, mainly between the newcomers and the locals. Whispers of a god-guided maiden spread, and soon the locals marched back into the land with blue flags and white lilies and reclaimed it from the English. The milestone hoped the fighting was over, and for almost 2 centuries it looked that way. Then the soldiers started carrying long, loud sticks. The milestone soon learned from the discussions that these were muskets and the men were musketeers. It didn't like it. Oh, and the noise. The road got busier every year, and soon the fields were made smaller to make way for the wider road. Then the first houses appeared in the fields and around the road. Noisy carts and horses replaced the cows and sheep. A church grew up nearby, ringing its bells several times daily, and the discussions never stopped. The locals complained about famine, feudalism, and their lives in general. The milestone missed the passing armies. The drumming and rhythmic marches were quiet in comparison. But then it regretted ever complaining about the noise of life, as it was replaced by constant fighting between the locals. It lasted only 10 years, but the milestone had never seen anything so bloody. A menacing-looking contraption called a guillotine was dragged past it. The milestone was glad it never saw it in action. From the conversation it had heard, it would have been something dreadful. And then another army marched by. They wore white trousers, dark blue coats and tall hats, led by a man on a tall horse with a funny flat hat on his head. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France. For several years the milestone heard various stories of his conquests until, as the locals used to say, Waterloo came. Then the talk of the man ceased and everything got quiet. The village became a town with many artists painting in the fields in the new style they called Impressionism. There were even the first carriages without horses. They were faster and much louder, but the milestone had become accustomed to the noise. It was certain that now, finally, the world would be calm, but then mayhem broke out. Bigger and bigger horseless carriages passed by. Some called tanks were so big that the world beneath the milestone shook, and suddenly there were carriages called aeroplanes in the sky. The world around it not only shook but also occasionally exploded. After a short silence, the fighting returned, this time brought on by angry-looking men in black uniforms with harsh language. Before the milestone could even learn the new language, an army of foreigners and locals marched by. The milestone was surprised to hear English again, and even more surprised to see them making friends with the locals. But their labor brought back some peace, and frightening men in black uniforms disappeared. Once again, life passed by. The town was repaired and then it grew. After a while, someone built a tiny house around the milestone, and now people come to look at it. It has heard so many different languages. At first it was confused by the flashes of light from the tiny boxes in their hands, but it learned what they meant in time and was flattered. Hopefully the world would be quiet again, but the milestone quickly pushed that thought aside. Every time it thought that, the world exploded. But even if it exploded again, the milestone felt that it would be quiet again. It was a thought it preferred to think.